Undead Lock is the name of the strategy that Bakura uses against Yugi in their duel in the final arc. The term Undead refers to the zombie-heavy deck, as well as the fact that Bakura turns his graveyard into ghosts hovering over the field. The lock part comes from Bakura limiting Yugi's moves, such as pinning down his monsters or limiting the number of attacks. The vast majority of the cards Bakura uses in this deck have not been released in real life, so let's have some fun with this one. Bakura is no stranger to alternative win conditions. The one we covered last week, Destiny Board, is his more popular one, but this strategy also aims to win another way, specifically by decking out the opponent. Mill decks have existed in the game's history, such as Empty Jar, so it's important here that, like with Exodia and Destiny Board, we craft a strategy that honors the alternate win condition without being a degenerate FTK. The other aspect of this is the lock. The idea behind this strategy is to set up a field that mills cards from your opponent's deck, then, as Bakura does to Yugi, lock them down from certain moves or protect your setup. To do this, we have the Necro series. Most of the cards Bakura uses in this strategy have the Necro name, but I change up the spelling to avoid mixing with other cards that have the word Necro in them. As such, the Undead Lock strategy becomes the Necro archetype. The first monster of the lineup is the only non-Necro one, and that is Disgraced Mage. He contributes to your lock by providing battle protection in two ways. First, your opponent can't target Necro monsters for attacks while you have him up, and second, when he battles a monster, he can shuffle both himself and the monster he's battling into the deck to get rid of threats to your board. He also has the added effect where at the start of either battle phase you can special summon him from hand. Of course, none of these effects can be activated unless you control a Necro monster, and that brings us to the Necro lineup. First is the retrain of Doom Caliber Knight, Necro Caliber Knight. Doom Caliber in the anime is a vanilla, but in real life is a monster effect negator. As such, Necro Caliber is based on that, where when your opponent activates a monster effect while you control a Necro card with a different name, you can negate the activation, then send one card from the top of their deck to the graveyard. So he contributes both to the milling and the lock by stopping monster effects. Next is Necro Jar. In the anime, this card is unaffected by spells, but in this adaptation, it protects all your Necro cards from being targeted by spells. It also has a mill effect where once per turn you can send the top two cards of your opponent's deck to the grave, and this card gains 200 attack for each. His last effect is also loosely based on his anime effect, whereas in the anime on Battle Destruction he mills from the opponent's deck one card for every multiple of 300 damage you take. This card on any destruction will mill one card for every multiple of 200 attack that its on-field attack was higher than its original. Up next is Necro Mannequin, which doesn't have an effect in the anime, but given its assembly appearance, its effect is fittingly that it reassembles into any other Necro monster. That's done by tributing it to special summon a different Necro monster from your deck, then it mills two from your opponent's deck. So this card on the surface is a miller, but it can transform into other millers or lock cards depending on what you need. Next is Necro Soldier, whose anime effect is to special another copy of himself from hand or deck during the opponent's standby phase, and that is retained here. But it has an added effect where when it's destroyed, you can add one Necro card from your deck, then send one card from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard for every Necro Soldier in your graveyard. So if you do get all three and all three are destroyed, that's 3 searches and 9 mills. Solid work by the Soldier. And finally is Necro Wall, whose anime effect is to spawn tokens for the purposes of contributing to more mills via counterbalance, but I've reimagined this based on the wall-like nature. You can reveal this card in your hand, then place a Necro counter on every Necro card you control, then special summon him, and while he's on the field or in your grave, if a card you control would be destroyed, you can remove a Necro counter from it instead. So this guy helps maintain your milling and locking pieces. The first spell in my opinion is the face of the deck, the adaptation of Cursed Twin Dolls. Adapting this one was a bit tricky because if you look at the anime text, it's very wordy and given the modern developments of the game can get very confusing. I also thought it would be a good idea to combine what this card does with counterbalance the actual mill card that Bakura uses into one card so as to avoid a fragile and inconsistent setup that relies on 2 continuous spells. As such, the effect that this card has is that you can only control one of it, and on activation, each player gets a gift. You get to set a Necro spell or trap from your deck, and if you do, your opponent draws a card. Then, the curses kick in, which for you is that monsters in your graveyard cannot be moved from the graveyard, so no making use of them in any sort of way. And the curse your opponent gets is that during their end phases, they mill one card from their deck for every monster on the field, plus the number of Necro monsters in your graveyard. The next spell is Spirit Sword of Sealing, which is just about word for word the same as the anime effect. Targets and banishes a monster while this card remains face up, and I added the condition here that it's treated as a Necro card so that it works with the rest of the archetype. The final spell is a net new one, the field spell Neckroyard. This card makes it so that any of those monsters you're milling off of your opponent's deck can't be summoned or activate their effects during the turn that they're sent from the deck to the grave. Its second effect expedites the milling, where each time a card is sent from your opponent's deck to the grave, this sends 2 more. And finally, this card allows you to mitigate the fact that you're turning your opponent's graveyard into a toolbox for them by letting you banish 2 monsters from their grave once per turn to search out 1 Disgraced Mage from your deck. The traps are all based on Bakura's cards, the first of which is Necroyard, the theme version of the card Neckroyard. This card in the anime makes it so that the opponent can only attack with 2 monsters per battle phase. This is reimagined into a stronger floodgate where each player can only declare an attack with 1 monster per turn, so more akin to the Dark Door, but also your opponent can't control more monsters than you do, and any extras are sent to the grave. Powerful effects, but they're all negated and this card is destroyed if you do not control a Necro monster. Next is Necro Cycle. In the anime, this allows Bakura to summon another copy of the mannequin if he already has one, but for this card, you can target a Necro monster you control, special summon a mannequin from your deck, then destroy the targeted one. And with the mannequin's ability to turn into any other Necro monster, this card essentially is letting you trade in 1 Necro monster for another, while also triggering any of your Necro monster effects that depend on being destroyed. And finally, we have Zoma the Necro. Bakura of course uses Zoma the Spirit, which is a card that already exists, so here is the retrain. This card too is a trap monster that comes out at 1800 attack and 500 defense. Its on-field effect is that it allows you to negate the activation of an effect that activates in the grave or targets a card in the grave. And then this Zoma pops itself, which isn't a terrible thing because it also has an effect where when destroyed while a monster, your opponent will mill 2 cards, then you draw 1 card for every monster sent to the grave this way. So if we add up the cards we have, that's 8 cards that provide some sort of milling, and as for locking, there are cards that negate your opponent's monster effects, provide protection against spell targeting, limit your opponent's attacks, provide destruction prevention, remove monster threats, limit your opponent's monsters, and slow or stop your opponent's graveyard monster effects. That, my friends, is the Undead Lock. Again, this one is tricky since it requires striking a good balance between effective but still allowing room for interaction with the opponent, i.e. not being solitaire or an FTK. Be sure to like and subscribe as we stay in the world of the Pharaoh's memories and visit the Ka of one of his most trusted advisors.